Yo, sir, how's it going?
It's going just fine. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for doing it again this year as well. I really appreciate this. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's basically going to be the same talk I gave last year, but it's the questions that people have that are really the most interesting bit.
Bro. Um, Seeing as it's like 5:10, or actually 5:11 now, um, I think we should just go ahead and start. We're also recording this, so if y'all have any friends who are missing out, they can watch this later. Welcome to the episode again. Welcome to the episode event. Thank you, Matthew Wells, for doing this again with us. Appreciate it. If y'all have any questions, please forward it to the chat. If you want to forward it to me, like my funny username, or to Kieran or to Ainsley, and we'll direct it towards the professor. So yeah.
To introduce Professor Wells for everybody, just so that they have an idea of who we're listening to for the next hour. It's a reminder that it runs from 5 to 6 p.m., so it's not too long, so I hope everybody can stick around for the duration of it. But Professor Matthew Wells is an associate professor for the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences. His research is currently conducted with his research group through field and laboratory studies. It aims to quantify the mixing in environmental flows, more specifically those in large lakes and the coastal ocean, where stratification and the Earth's rotation play a dominant role in dynamics. Some of his areas of research include turbidity currents and density currents. So if that interests anybody, then you can also talk to Professor Matthew Wells right after, but he has some ideas about graduate school and master's school. So I'll let Professor Wells take the floor from here.
Hi everyone, I'm glad we can still do this over Zoom. It's not quite as much fun as doing it in person. So a big limitation about doing this on Zoom is I can't make eye contact with everyone and take questions as we go through. So what I talked about doing with Kieran was that if you have a question, simplest thing might be to send in the chat a message to Kieran, and then I'm going to pause it a few times during this presentation, and then Kieran can ask me the questions from you. Or if you want to, you can turn on your video and ask me directly. So I've tried to split this talk into 3 parts so we can pause and ask questions. But at the end, if you've got some more open-ranging questions, we can talk about them there. So the main reason I wanted to give this talk was I probably haven't met most of you. I mainly teach 3rd and 4th year classes and graduate classes. So I haven't taught any of the large first and second year classes at DPAS. So I'm sit on a few graduate admissions committees for physics, geography, graduate programs, and also the environmental science graduate program at Scarborough. And for doing this, I have to read a lot of applications. And sometimes we were reading this and we thought, wow, you know, the students might benefit from having some guidance as to what they really should be putting into the application so that they can be competitive and really showing their skills as much as they can. So I've got this presentation I put together that's got some ideas. It's not specific to environmental science in general. It's just a general statement about graduate admissions to any program anywhere, not just Canada. I'm originally from Australia. I left Australia and worked in Europe for a couple of years, and then the States before coming to Canada. So I've been in, you know, different countries and different departments, but the sort of general ideas about applying to graduate school are the same everywhere. So, or at least the universities I was at. So I'll share my presentation now, and you won't see my, okay, now I'll just make that full screen. Okay, so I'm giving this talk today specifically about the application process of applying to graduate school. Professor Carl Mitchell, he's the graduate chair in DPES for our master's and PhD programs. He's going to give a talk specifically about those programs in a month's time. So these are sort of two related talks. So what I wanted to talk about today was what is the actual graduate application process look like? It's good to know this in advance. You don't want to suddenly decide, I want to go to graduate school, and then realize there's actually quite a bit of stuff that you need to have thought about beforehand. And often it seems to take students by surprise, which is why I wanted to give this talk now in October before you're thinking about applying in a couple of months' time. So if you want to apply to any graduate program, there's actually three things you need. The first one, that's probably the most obvious one, is that you need to have good grades, and they need to be in subjects and fields that are relevant to the sort of program you're trying to go for. So, you know, you wouldn't want to try and apply for a master's program in English if your major's primarily in, you know, environmental science. Could work, but it'd be a difficult case to make. Now, the two bits that perhaps students aren't so really familiar with is that they need letters of reference from several professors, and they need a strong statement letter. So I wanted to talk a bit about what that specifically means. What is this letter of reference, and, you know, who should you ask for that? And then also what you should include in the statement letter. And some ideas about, if you're in second and third year, what you might do to get yourself in a position where you could get a good letter of reference and you'd be able to write a strong statement letter. So those are the things I really wanted to go through. Okay, so what is specifically the School of Graduate Studies at U of T actually just want to? So you can go through, these are the links to their websites. You can click on them and have a look at specifically what they want to get. So they want a university transcripts, they'll want a reference letters, and they'll want a statement from you. And so other schools in Canada look pretty similar, but I'll just use SGS as an example because that's where we are. So if you open up the online application thing, it's got this all this text down here, but the bit I highlighted is it says, if you choose to submit your application one sitting, it'll take approximately 30 to 60 minutes to complete. So that's the bit I want to talk about. That's technically true. If you've got everything lined up and you've got all your documents ready, you could probably submit them all in that amount of time. But it's actually to do all the work to get to that stage might take you several weeks or possibly even months in advance to do that. So when I see these things on the other end, I often get the impression that perhaps students did only spend 30 to 60 minutes like getting this all together. But I just really want to emphasize it's a lot longer. That's how long it'll take to submit all the documents on this website, not how long it should take you to actually get ready for the whole process. So what does SGS specifically want? The SGS has if you're a fourth year student and you're applying directly for a master's or PhD program, you generally cannot get into any programs if your GPA in the last 2 years is less than a B+. So I've been involved with geography, earth science, physics, to some extent EEB, and also the programs at UTSC, the Masters of Environmental Science and the Physical Environmental Science. So there's a strong requirement. SGS will not let you get into a program if you have grades less than that. So sometimes, you know, if you've done a lot of work experience, you could make a case that that doesn't matter. But if you're coming directly out of an undergrad, that's the sort of minimum requirement. But you need to know, like, how much above the minimum do you need to have? Like, do you need to have a A-, A+? So you need to know how competitive the program's getting into. How much, you should also ask about how much financial support they have and how much coursework they do. So you probably know from talking that, you know, medical school, graduate school at medical school, law school is very, very competitive. And the acceptance rates into most med schools and law school programs are about 10%. So, you know, for those programs, you need to have straight A+ grades and really good letters of reference. So in science graduate programs, the acceptance rates are different. They're definitely a lot less than 10%, but it really depends which program you're applying for. So for instance, artificial intelligence is a bit of a hot topic right now, and I've got a friend who works at the Vector Institute, and he says they're probably one of the most competitive science programs to get into, and they've got about 10% success rate. But I'd say for most science programs, the acceptance rates are much higher. So probably 30 or 50% of students who are plausible will get in. So what does plausible mean? It means you've actually got good grades, you've got the right background, and most importantly, there's a potential supervisor who's got the money and interest to take on a student. So the key thing I wanted to get taking away from this is you don't just decide I want to apply for a program and apply. You have to have a conversation well in advance of applying to sort of work out, you know, is there a good fit and is someone willing to take you on? And then sort of the application is really the last thing you do. So so there's actually 3 things you submit to SGS. There's this transcript, which is your grades. Do you have the grades that are greater than the B+, and also in relevant subject areas? There's the reference letters from your referees, and then there's also the supporting documents. And this is where there'll be a letter you write saying what your reasons for applying are. Okay, so the grades should indicate you've done well in courses that are relevant, and yeah, that's of course really important, but there's not much advice I can give you on that right now, except, you know, study hard and turn up to all the lectures on time. So first, what are these references of letters? What are these letter reference? So when, typically in January or February, I start getting emails like this from the SGS School of Graduate Studies or other universities if students have applied and asked me for a letter. So this particular one, I've just blanked out the details, but I get a letter from SGS when the student applies, and then they give me a link to click on. Then I have to fill this out by a particular time in February. So what I see is I see what the students submitted. I see their, I only see the transcript and the documents they set in. So that's sometimes enough to do it. Now, what do I actually write? I have to write a letter, and you know, I type it in blank script, and then it looks like this. Ideally, I should write a page for the student. If I only write a paragraph, like I say, student X was in my class and they got a grade of an A. If that's all I know about the student, it's not a terribly good reference letter. So ideally, I try and only write letters for students who I can actually say something meaningful about, like they took a research course with me and they did these things, or I have some experience where I can fill up a whole page about them. Sometimes the students can provide me with that information. They can give me a detailed CV and they can highlight bits of experience they have that would help me fill out a page. But you've got to, the thing that's challenging for the professor who's writing this is they have to be able to know enough about the student, like give actual details so they can fill up a whole page or maybe a page and a half. So if it's a student I know really well, like they've done a research project with me, or maybe they've been on a field class or something, I can usually write a whole page. But if it's a student I barely recognize their name, it's hard to write more than 2 lines here. So your task as a student is to pick someone who can actually write a decent, who knows enough, who can write a long letter. And so in addition to this, I don't think SGS does it, but some other schools, they also ask you to list the student in categories. So they say, is this particular student in the top 2%, 10%, 20%, you know, of all the students you've ever taught? And so I can click all these buttons, but it only makes any sense if when I write the letter, I can give some examples about why I'm putting the student in that number. If I don't give any reasons, whoever's reading this, if I just click 2%, 2%, 2%, but I don't give any reasons why I think they're good, whoever's reading this will tend to disregard it. So ideally, it's someone who knows you well, but who should you really ask for? They should be academic references. Sometimes when I've read, people have got their friends to write them letters, or their priest, or their co-worker, or a TA. Most of the admissions committee isn't terribly interested in those sort of references. They'd really like someone who can assess your ability to how you do in their graduate program. So that generally means another professor. So who should you ask for a reference? I should say, when should you ask for a reference? So you should ask well in advance. Like if I need to find the time to write a really good page of prose, it's going to take me quite a bit of time, and I'm usually busy. So it's not, you don't ask for a reference like a few days before it's due. Ideally, you'd ask like a month in advance. And when you're asking, you need to say, be quite specific, you know, could you write me a letter for this particular program? I'm applying because I think it would suit various things. And then you should provide information like a CV, transcript, a letter, so that whoever's writing the reference letter can echo some of the things you say. So if the student really spells out, you know, some of the skills they've got, I can put those in a reference letter and it will come across quite strongly. So what am I writing? I'm writing to my peers. They're often people I know who are on other graduate committees. And so I have to be honest. I can't just say this is the best student ever, because if they get into the graduate school and they bomb out, then the people are going to not trust me next time I write a letter. So I have to be honest and realistic about what the students are saying. If I say every student's average or amazing, then people will tend to disregard it. So, whereas if I could say this particular student is the best student I've ever taught, you know, and people know who I am, then this carries quite a lot of weight. So there've been times I've had students I've known quite well who haven't actually had particularly good grades. I won't tell you who. But I've been able to like write a really good letter to talk about other things they've done, you know, school problem solving sets they've done. And I can think of a couple of examples of students who've gone on to do graduate programs despite not having good grades. So if you have a strong letter, it can make up for things that possibly might be missing in your transcript. So there's been a bit of discussion about how people sometimes have gender bias when they're writing letters, and you have to make sure that who's writing your letters not going to, it's kind of, sometimes in the past people have tended to use fairly soft words to describe female candidates and harder words to describe male candidates. So you'd like to have the list of someone, whoever's writing a reference for you, to be able to use these words in their statement. So-and-so was successful at doing this. They were accomplished at that. They were skilled at this. They were insightful at that. They were confident in that. So you need to give the letter writer answers, statements where they could use these particular adjectives to describe them. So this is where I go back to, if the only thing I know about the student is they got a particular grade in a class that I taught 2 years ago, it's hard to say, to use these really strong adjectives that are on the right. So that's what you'd like a letter to have, somewhere where they use half of those adjectives to describe particular things you've done. Yeah, so if you want to, about this, I use Twitter quite a lot. A lot of academics, you know, share ideas on Twitter. And about this time of year, there's a lot of comments people are putting up on Twitter about how to apply to graduate school. They're putting up opportunities in graduate school. So I put a few links that I noticed some of my colleagues had put up about steps for graduate school that you could check on. So I thought now might be we could have a little pause, and if you've got some questions about that you can send to Kieran about who should you ask for a reference letter, I could take those now.
Yeah, we have one question from Evelyn. It says, how do we make sure the prof uses the right wording?
Well, I think giving evidence that makes it clear. So it depends a bit on your relationship with the person. If you don't provide, so if someone's going to try and write a page about you, and all they really know is the interactions they've had with you that might be a bit soft, there's maybe a tendency that they might try and use those words. But if you can like give a list of accomplishments you've done, like I did this thing and that thing, so that there's no need to say that you're caring or you're kind, like that's all nice. It's good to be caring and kind, but it'd be much better if they could say, you know, Evelyn was accomplished at this, she was very skilled at that. And, you know, if you give a list of like your CV, a well-written CV, it should be clear what things you've done are relevant to the reference letter. So it's really giving, you know, choosing someone who you think's going to write a good letter, but also giving them the information that they should like to put in the letter. You know, sometimes I struggle to think about what to actually write if I don't have a lot of information. I don't want to write, so if I want to try and write at least half or 3/4 of a page, I have to think of something to put in there. And if I don't have any hard evidence, it's challenging to write a good letter sometimes.
Okay.
Were there any other questions? No?
Yeah. Are we able to see like the reference letter they write for us or no?
No, that's the whole point.
Okay. So
it's
like
anonymous.
we can really, like we can only try our best to list all the accomplishments, but like the word choice is still up to them.
Yeah, but so this is where having a relationship with someone you trust comes in.
Yeah. Okay.
So most people would rather say they don't want to write. It's very unlikely you'd get someone who'd say this is not a good student. They're much more likely to decline the opportunity to write a reference letter.
Okay.
So there's just no benefit to writing a negative reference letter, but there's differences between how strong the reference letter would be. And so, you know, you really need to have someone where you kind of can trust their judgment and, you know, that they actually know you as a person rather than just a face in the crowd.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Sometimes, so I even as a professor, I still sometimes need reference letters. And it's usually when I'm like writing for grant applications, sometimes I need to get a letter of support from someone else. And so often what I actually do is I actually draft the letter for someone else to write. Like I put in all the information that I think's relevant, and then I let someone else edit that. It's a little bit presumptuous, but you know, you might say, if someone agrees to write your reference letter, you might say, well, these are the things that I think I'd really like you to put in, and I've sort of taken the liberty of drafting it. And then they can see whether they actually agree with that and, you know, maybe change it. But, you know, you can be quite forward, maybe, if it's appropriate, to help with the reference choice. But the whole point is confidential what actually gets written in that reference letter. So it never sees the light of day. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Were there any other questions for now?
Sorry, yeah, I have one question. It's kind of more like, it's 2 questions, but it's kind of more like one question. So the first is from Areem. It's, since classes are online, it's harder to build a good relationship with professors. How can we still show our skills to them? And then of a similar vein, there's a question from, I don't have the name for it, but what advice do you have for a 4th year who hasn't got any references yet?
Yeah, I agree. It's challenging right now to build a good relationship with someone, but you can still. So I guess an example of a reference I really struggle with is if someone writes to me and says, I took your class 2 years ago, I got this particular grade in your class, could you write a reference letter? And I can't actually honestly remember them at all. It would have been a lot better if they said, I took this class 2 years ago at this grade, and I have this list of like accomplishments, could you write me a reference letter? Because then I could say, well, maybe I can't remember them in the class, but I could sort of talk about their accomplishments that they had done. So ideally, you'd have a strong relationship with the person, but if you don't, you'd give them enough information that they could still write you a reference letter. So that means you do quite a bit of the work, actually, packaging up all the information, so you make it easy for them to write your reference letter. It's just when I get these requests saying, could you write me a reference letter tomorrow? And I can't actually remember who the student is. That's where I'm more likely to just say, no, actually, I can't write you a reference letter because it's not possible. So again, it's October now. If you're at all interested in, getting a reference letter from someone, you could start, having conversations with people. Even though we're not in our offices and we don't have, you can't just go and knock on someone's door. You can set up a Zoom appointment with someone and have a sort of an office hour and chat with someone if you want to. Most people would be very willing to do that. Did that answer the question? Was there two questions? That was one of them. What was the other one?
Yeah, sorry, it's just the general question of like, how do we get in a position to receive a letter or, position ourselves? We've got another question too from Joanne. It's not directly about reference letters, but how would we secure a supervisor? So get in that position.
Yeah, so I think I have a little bit about that later on, but basically you have to start a conversation. So, you have to sort of send an email out to someone saying, I'm interested in your research. Well, ideally you're interested in their research. You've had a look on their website and maybe looked at some of the recent papers and seen what they're doing, and then say, do you have any opportunities? So for me to take on a new graduate student, I have to have had a grant successfully funded recently where I can pay not only for the graduate stipend, but also for the costs of actually doing field-based research. So, when I do field-based research, it's quite expensive. And so I need to have funds available to do that. So, that'd be the question that you'd really want to ask. Are you looking for any graduate students? And maybe they say yes, maybe they say no, or maybe you just say, could I talk about it? And they might be able to suggest other colleagues at other universities or within the department who might also be looking. And often what you think you're interested in isn't necessarily like, as an undergrad, you haven't maybe seen that much. And so just having a conversation with a professor, they might be able to suggest opportunities or things that you could look into. I mean, most professors, if they've got money, they're always looking for talented students to work with them. So it's really just a matter of like finding out what opportunities. The best way to do it, of course, is to do some undergraduate research program, like either a summer program or a DO9, D10 program, or maybe a work study program where, a professor can see what you actually like doing research, and then they could maybe suggest that you think about doing something a bit more serious with it. Is that helpful?
Hope so. Do you want to take any more questions right now, or should we continue with the presentation? We have two questions, but we can also ask them at the end if you'd rather.
How about we just keep going for a little bit, and then, because I might answer it in the next section.
I'll hold on to your question.
Okay, so there's three things. You need the good grades, you need these reference letters that talk about you as a person and what skills you have and why you do well in a graduate program. That's really what the letter needs to say. It needs to say more than just they got good grades, but you know, that you're creative, you can write well, you can manage your time well, and you do well at graduate school. So there's this other thing, we need to write a statement of purpose. So it's called a statement of purpose, but it's an application letter. And so it's usually a one-page letter. And this is the bit that I often feel gets really overlooked in SGS applications, because sometimes I have to read 100 of these. And you know, to be honest, the prose in them is not always excellent. So this is a kind of tricky document to write. In one page, you sort of have to say why you're applying to graduate school. You need to talk about what your career objectives are, and you need to say why you're good at this. Now, I think in Canadian universities, you typically don't write one of these to get into undergraduate. Is that correct? Kieran?
We wrote it for like UBC.
Okay. Yeah, so
Yeah.
some universities do this, but I'm not sure that they do it at University of Toronto. I certainly didn't do it in Australia, but I know at a lot of the elite universities in the US, you know, a lot of emphasis is applied. Like say if you're trying to get into Harvard or Stanford, you have to write an application letter, and a lot of weight is really placed on that letter. But so in Canada, I think there's less emphasis on writing these letters, and so this often comes up at graduate school. It's maybe the first time students have really spent a lot of time writing these letters. So this will take a while to write. This is not 30 to 60 minutes. This is something where you'd probably want to go through several drafts and, you know, really work on your writing. And so there's lots of advice how to do this. The main thing is you start early. You don't do this the night before. You maybe do this like a few weeks beforehand, and you look at how other people have written it. The bit that kind of drives me a bit nuts is there's so many of these letters I read that start with, ever since I was a child, I've loved the environment. And you go, oh, really? So, you know, if you could just not ever use that phrase in a letter to graduate school, it might be true. Maybe ever since you were a child, you have loved the environment, but it's a bit of a cliche. And so you really want to talk about, you know, your skills, your career objectives, and why you think there's a good fit between what you do and what the graduate school is. And it's sort of really an opportunity to show that you can write well, which is a really important part of graduate school. So this is something that you need to spend a bit of time working on. You know, you might want to give some drafts, go through several versions of it. So there's two types. They're all programs at SGS have at least that. At the Masters of Environmental Science program, there's actually two forms that you want. One's this department entry summary form, which is basically equivalent to that application letter. And so it's got this specific question. Please tell us why you wish to pursue training in environmental science based on your personal, professional, educational experiences. Where do you hope this degree will take you? If you're applying to a particular field of study, please elaborate on why. Please discuss your motivation towards the internship or research enrollment option. So that's really 6 questions there. And you want to read that really carefully and provide something that really addresses all of that. And wasting a whole sentence on saying you've loved the environment ever since you're a child is not really addressing those points. There's also this other letter that's about a page where you can go through some background, explain some of the context of your academic and you know, what you want to do in the MSc program. So these are not things, the one thing I want to emphasize, these are not things you do at the last minute. You know, they require foresight and application. The other thing you really want to avoid doing, if you're applying for multiple schools, you've got to make absolutely sure that you tailor the letters to different schools. It looks really bad when someone's applying for University of Toronto and they send a letter that says, I really want to do a graduate program at the University of Guelph because you know, they've just forgotten to change the application. Usually the graduate schools are different enough that you would want to have somewhat individualized letters to each school. Okay, so if you're doing a professional degree like the Masters of Environmental Science we have at Scarborough, you're really applying to the program. But for research master's degrees, you're particularly usually applying to work with a specific supervisor and a particular program. So what that means is you should have got in touch with them well beforehand, so probably, a couple of months before a back and forth conversation. And, they've almost agreed to take you on before you actually put the application in. So sometimes that's not really clear. I can see letters where students are applying for the program, but they haven't reached out in ahead of time to really work out who they're going to work with. And so they don't have someone who's barracking for them on the applications committee saying, this student should get in because, I've been in touch with them, they sound great. And so if you've done all that work, part of that letter will go in the statement of purpose letter, so it's not just about you. It's like, I want to work with Professor X because I'm really interested in this work. I've got this great background and work experience. This will help me with my long-term career goals. And you can quite easily write a really strong letter with that. So I realized for a lot of science students, a problem with doing a straight science degree is you often don't have much opportunity to really develop your writing. You get really good at quantitative reasoning, data analysis, maybe chemical techniques, but you don't get really good at polishing your prose. I had this problem. I did a math and physics degree in Australia, and I had one course in first year where I actually wrote essays, and they weren't great essays, and no one ever really taught me how to write essays. So it was really in graduate school I had to teach myself how to write better. So normally, if COVID wasn't around, I'd suggest that you go to the writing center at UTSC. They could book, they can book appointments. Maybe they are having sort of virtual appointments now. You can get in touch with them and find out. But there's people you can talk to about how improving your prose. They used to have a service where they would read things for you and talk about what you'd written and give you suggestions on how to make it better. So basically, every single writer, you can always make it better. No matter how good you are, there's always ways you can improve whatever you've written. So they've got some advice there about writing letters, and you could get help from them for more advice. This is a document from Yale University, where I used to work, about how to apply to graduate school at Yale. So Yale's pretty competitive to get into in most of the programs, and so this is a sort of series of steps. How you prepare, what your goals are, what you should avoid, and then how you write it. And so they go through quite a few steps about what you should improve for a really good letter. So, just to emphasize again, this is not something you do in 30 minutes. It's something you mull over for a couple of weeks and, polish up and go through some drafts and write a really good step. But if you actually read all this and followed their advice, and you've got evidence that you could have the skills that you need, then you could write a really strong letter. So does anyone have any questions about what this statement of purpose letter is, the application letter?
I don't think we have any questions regarding that right now.
Okay. So again, the one thing I want to emphasize is it's not something you do the night before you send the application in, because it's not just a matter of having something that doesn't have any typos. It's got to be something that whether it really flows and it's a good document to read, and it's an example of how well you can craft an idea, which is really what science is all about, being able to write well and craft ideas and communicate them. So this is your sort of opportunity to show that you shine as a writer. Okay, so this is going back to a question someone asked earlier. Say you're a second or third year student. How do I go about positioning myself so that I have a good academic mentor? So sometimes when you're a student in a large class, you don't really get in contact with a professor, and particularly right now with Zoom, it's sort of hard to, maybe make that personal connection. So what can you do? You can actually ask questions in class. A lot of students don't really seem to speak up in class, but most professors are always thrilled to have a conversation. And so just attending office hours, going to tutorials, asking questions, showing that you're engaged is a way to start a relationship. The ideal thing you want to do is do something where you actually demonstrate that you've had research experience with the professors. So there's work study placements. You can ask professors, do you have, sometimes when I have something very specific to do, I'll advertise. If I'm having trouble finding someone, I'll put an advertisement up on the work study program. But usually I know people who I can do that with. So, that's one place to start. You can always ask, is there an opportunity to get work study places? It's also, you should, rather than take really large classes, seek out some small classes where you can actually interact with professors. So one example of this in earth sciences are field courses. So we have, in a normal year, we have 4 field classes. There's 2 called field camp, 1 called field course, and a 4th one called, it's got a very similar sounding name. I forget what it is. They're not running right now because of COVID. We can't go out into the field, but hopefully next year we can. So in addition to these, let's see if this link works. In addition to these programs, there's also something you might not have heard about called the Ontario University's Program in Field Biology. So I used to alter this. How it works is there's about 20 universities in Ontario that run courses, and they allow them to be taken by students from other universities. So when I've done a field course in the class, I allowed about 8 students from other universities to take this course. And then in return, students from University of Toronto could take courses with other universities. So I'll see if I can click on that link. There might not be anything. Can you still see my screen? Hang on, I'll do the whole thing. Okay, so usually there's about 20 different courses that the Ontario Program in Field Biology takes. So loading. Okay, at the moment they're all cancelled, but there's 30 courses that they take, which sound really fascinating, and they're all in all sorts of places. Some of them are in Taiwan, California, Belize, some of them in Toronto. There's a range of different places you can take these field courses. They're generally small, and so they have the opportunity that you could really get to know a professor well. So some of them are like 2 weeks long. You go somewhere, you do a lot of field methods, you're working really closely with someone. Who's ever working with that gets to know you as a person. So that's something to consider. So in addition to that, there's so work study, field courses. You can take reading courses. This is where you write an essay based on a series of papers that a professor advises you to, and these are normally thought to be an introduction to a 1 semester or 2 semester research course. So that's the sort of sequence. There's a professor you're interested in, you might do a work study placement with them, then perhaps take a readings course and then do a research course with them. And if you did all that, I've had a number of students do that. They're the students I get to know really well, and I can write really strong reference letters for, and I can give them a lot of mentorship advice. So I would also recommend you can attend research seminars to see what is cutting edge research people are doing. Usually we'd have these about every 2 weeks in the department. They're not happening right now, but One good thing about COVID is that most universities are putting these online. So if I want to, I can actually attend seminars at other universities. So for example, over the summer, the Canadian Geophysics Union had a series of seminars every 2 weeks, which you could attend from all over Canada. This link here, the one above it, is some colleagues are having a limnology seminar. So they've got a series about lakes talks, and a colleague from Wisconsin Madison is giving a talk in a week or two about salt in lakes. So I'm quite involved with the physics department where the Center for Global Climate Change Research seminars on. They're having talks every 2 weeks. Rather than having invited speakers come in from overseas, they're getting speakers from within U of T to talk. And next week, I'm kind of excited, a colleague from the Navy School at Monterey in California is giving a talk in physics. And again, it's got a Zoom link, so you can go and listen to those. So these are kind of technical research talks. But, you know, if you're really engaged, you could sort of attend these and find out what's going on. And then you've got something to talk about with the professor afterwards. So what else could you do? During summer, you could apply for a research training award. So if you've got grades that are good enough to go into graduate school, you've got grades that are good enough to get one of these awards. They're usually about $6,000 over the summer to work on a project. I actually had a student this summer. I met him twice in person, but he worked with me for 10 weeks over the summer, and we've got a paper that we should be able to push. He got a CGCS award to do this. So there's NSERC awards, CGCS awards from that Center Downtown Physics, and also ETSC. We have awards. So this is to do stuff at University of Toronto. But pretty much all Canadian and US universities have programs like this. So say you wanted to go somewhere, you know, within Canada would be easy, or within the US might be a bit more challenging. You know, to try change of scenery, find out what other people are doing. This would be an excellent way to see if you like a professor that you potentially want to go to graduate school. So it's pretty common in like 3rd or 4th year to do this as a sort of trial to see if you'd want to go graduate school somewhere. And, you know, these are the strongest references that you get from someone. You know, this person did an intensive summer research program with me, and I can write really strong references about a student who does this. So UTSC does have a small fund to help students go to conferences. Not quite sure what that means this year because pretty much all conferences are virtual. So there are still some fees associated with the conference, but they're a lot less. You don't have to pay for hotels and accommodation anymore. But I haven't checked this link, but in the past, you know, if you had some research you'd done and you were going to present it at a conference, you could get a subsidy from Student Affairs to go to it. There's also a small journal that some of the teaching professors in the chemistry stream at UTSC run, where you can write little research So say you've done a little DO9 project, you want to write it up, you can submit it into this journal. So, you know, if you actually had a co-authored research publication or you'd presented somewhere, this would really be the gold standard for getting into a good graduate program somewhere. So, you know, if you wanted to go to the US somewhere, and they saw, oh, you know, this student, they did some summer work, they're listed as a co-author on this research publication, that really demonstrates they've got the skills. This would be how you get a really strong package to go into a graduate program elsewhere. So you can also think a bit bigger. You know, one advantage we have in Canada is that you're a native speaker of English, which is the language of science right now. Wasn't always the case when I was my uncle, when he went to university to go to graduate school, there's still a lot of things to read in German or Russian in chemistry, but now English dominates the language of science. So if you've got a strong science background, in theory, you could go anywhere. So, you could think about the United States, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, in Germany or Holland, where I used to work. Most of the research is conducted in English. France, you probably would need to speak French, but there's a lot more than just University of Toronto to think about. The main, in all these places, the main thing is just to reach out to someone who you could potentially do research with, and talk about your skill sets that you have. So for instance, when I worked at Yale, they used to have this weekend that they'd try and compete for the best talent. They'd actually fly students in to interview them if they thought they were good enough, and they'd try and convince them to move there. So you can think big. If you got good, you can think. If you have background, you can think quite big. So I realize younger people than me probably don't use Twitter, but this is really the social media platform that a lot of scientists communicate on. So if you know where to look, there's a lot of professors talking about things. It's not all politics. It's a lot of people talking about, I need a graduate student. This is some advice I have for graduate school. This is some peeves I have. In the US at the moment, this now is when people are applying. So I'm seeing a lot of advice and a lot of opportunities. People are posting about specific things in graduate school. So it's kind of interesting to get a sense of what's going on. So these are some other resources I found at UTM. They had a thing about writing personal statements, and this one from McGill and one from Berkeley. And I think that was everything I had to say. So there were some questions I didn't answer earlier. Maybe what I've said has spoken to some of that, but if it hasn't, I could elaborate now. Well, that's 6, so we're going to end pretty soon. Maybe I'll stick around for 10 minutes and then we can answer some of those questions.
There's some extra time in the meeting, so yeah, if anybody wants to stick around, then we'll do some questions right now. I have one. What accomplishments do we need to mention when we ask a professor for references or a reference?
Well, okay, so see if like beyond just the grades you've got in your classes, for instance. So say, what sort of thing might be interesting? So research projects are often a lot harder to explain than just grade. Some sort of like what you actually did in the research, what sort of outcomes you had, what did you actually do, who did you work with? There's a lot more than just the actual grade that would go into that. In some cases, people might have had an interesting job that's relevant to the graduate school application, or they might have been involved with some volunteer organization. Like there's environmental organizations that some students have been involved with. Some stuff's not particularly relevant, like I don't know. Well, anything you think that would help make a stronger reference letter, you'd have to use a bit of judgment about what's useful information. I didn't answer the question.
Yeah, hopefully. We have a question from Sahana. For summer research programs, does this apply to subjects like history, public policy, etc. as well?
I don't know, to be honest. I only really know what. So in the sciences, there's certainly a lot of opportunities to fund this. So one of them was through NSERC. I presume SHIRC probably has some equivalent. Okay, so Shirk and the UT University of Toronto Scarborough summer internships would probably have similar opportunities. I think there's a bit of a fundamental difference though. So scientists tend to have labs and so have people working on projects together, whereas I gather the research model in humanities is a lot more individualized. So professors don't really work with students so much. They tend to write themselves. So I'm not quite sure if there's the same culture of having a lot of student mentees. So typically most scientists would have like 5 or 6, student mentees at any particular time they're working with, whereas I understand that research in the humanities is a bit different, and so you don't necessarily mentoring the same number of students that scientists tend to do. So I think there are things at the cultures that takes place. But, ask a professor. They could point you in the right direction for sure.
All right, Sahana says thank you for that.
Any other questions?
Yeah, does anybody else have any questions?
Oh, I have a question. So, say I have 2 potential referees that I can ask. One knows me like better, but is not exactly in the field that I want to apply for. The other is in the field, but he doesn't know me as well, personally, for example. Like, which one would you say is like better to go for, or do you think?
Usually need 3. You usually need like several references.
Yeah.
So, so ideally you get people from different, that complement. In an ideal world, the people might complement different aspects of you. And skill set, someone else might context, and ideally the different viewpoints might shine different light on you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I mean, it's often hard to get 3 people in total, so no one's going to be perfect.
Right.
So you might have to like a few different people. But the main thing is to ask early. I mean, it just drives me nuts when people ask me the day before the reference has to do, and I go, "There's no possible way I can physically do this." Yeah.
Okay, noted. Also, for those grad schools, like, do they
and
have?
If you ask early, then there's the opportunity to have more conversation, so they can.
Right. Okay.
You go.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Is there like a deadline for grad schools to send out like acceptance or like rejection letters, or do they usually like wait for all applicants to apply first and then decide, or do they like look right after you apply and then they'll decide like if you're good or not?
We often have like quotas of how many students we're able to take in, and so usually, like if there's strong students, they'll make offers to them as early as possible, because if they're a really good student, they might go somewhere else. And so usually, and so depending on how many that is in, when does this take place? March or April?
Mm-hmm.
So in the master's program, we probably like make these first round of offers to students, and then depending on any students accept, like go elsewhere, then they might make a second of offers. So usually they'll, the really strong students will get offered immediately, and then there might, if there's still space and there's interest, there might be offers that come out later on.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. So I think everything has to go done by the 15th of February, and then there's usually a whole round of like meetings where, we have these big committees, and you'll sort of discuss all the applicants and evaluate them. Sometimes the meetings go for 2 days. They're really long. This is why I get really annoyed when I just keep on meeting again and again. I've loved the environment ever since I was a child.
Okay.
Yeah, and so then, then you'll sort of rank them and say, so usually it's really easy to rank the top students and it's really easy to rank the bottom students. What's often really hard is to evaluate most of the students who are kind of in the middle. And so that's where, you know, you have to read the letters really carefully and say, well, you know, like, how do you sort of rank them all? But, you know, like if some students are really stellar, that's really obvious. And if they're really terrible, that's really obvious. It's just most students are kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
And so that's where you need people to give some detail to really spell out. And in your application letter, you know, give some specific detail about things you've done, indicate you'd be a good fit for this particular, whatever graduate program you're applying for.
Okay, I see. All right, thank you, sir. Yeah, that's all the questions. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Sir, I have a question. So, in regards of the reference letters, is it like more the merrier, right? So you try to get as many as possible, or is it like you try to get the strongest, try to ask for the strongest referral?
Well, I think you can ask for up to 3, but you know, it's a lot of work for people to actually write these. If someone's going to write it properly, so it's unlikely you're going to have heaps of people who know you really well who are going to be able to write you a really strong reference letter. I mean, I don't think I could drum up a huge number of people who'd be willing to spend the time to write me a good reference letter. So if you can only get 1, that looks a bit weird. Like you sort of think, you know, does this person only know 1 person who can write him or her a reference letter? So, you know, you want to get like 2 or 3, and it's often a bit hard to find 2 or 3 people who know you well enough, who've got the time to do it, who can actually do it. So it's not easy coming up with 3 people who you've sort of developed some sort of relationship with over the last few years who can actually write something about it. So, you know, it's not trivial. You know, you have to put a bit of work in to build relationships so that, you know, people are willing to do that for you. It's not something you can just ask a week beforehand and say, or if you want a good reference letter. Otherwise, they're just going to say, oh, this student took my class and got this grade, and to be honest, I can't remember a lot more about them. So if you are hoping to apply for a graduate school, you know, I'd start developing a relationship with someone before you actually get to the point of asking them to write you a reference letter. Does that answer your question? You're asking is the more the merrier. So yes, more is better, but it's not, realistically, if you can even get 3, that'd be doing really well.
Okay. All right. That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This is going to be again about sort of like the information you would write on your application. So should you write achievements that are more like academically related, or should we also include some other extracurriculars, for example, where we showed maybe leadership or just volunteering at some things that are not really related to the program that you're applying to?
Well, you'd have to think of a way to make them relate, you know, so maybe you have good organizational skills that have been developed through some activity, or, you know, like leadership's sort of important at being a student, but it's not, you know, being good organization, good public speaking, good writing skills, you know, whatever you do, you'd have to like make some case about how it's related to being good at graduate school, or how you think it might be good at being good at graduate school. Like, you know, say if you're a really good runner, you know, running in and of itself isn't particularly useful in graduate school. But to be a good runner, you've got to be really dedicated, and takes a lot of training and perseverance, and, you know, those sort of attributes of like being a good runner that are relevant to graduate school. It's not getting from point A to point B really quickly. It's not terribly useful for graduate school, but the perseverance and training that would be required to do that is relevant. So you'd have to sort of spin it so that it was clear what the relevance any personality was to the graduate school application. So just say sing in a choir, that's nice, but that's not in itself not really useful. But if you could put some angle on it that made it really clear why this was a really positive attribute.
Okay, thank
So maybe
you.
we'll take a few more questions, and I've got to leave.
Yeah, there's one more question. So we can close it off after that. Thanks for staying a little bit later. The question is, how would you recommend finding a professor who will be a good fit for you? It's one thing to find a professor with similar research interests, but lab culture and working style will vary between different professors and can definitely impact your grad school experience.
Sure. So this is where I think just reaching out and talking to people is what you need to do. I know this is a bit intimidating, but most people love talking about themselves. So I think you'll all agree if you're having a conversation with someone, just asking them about themselves is always a great opening. And so it's so easy now to find out what people do. Most professors have website. If they don't have a website, you can go onto public sources to see what their most recent papers are. So but to start a conversation, first you go and have a look at a couple of their recent papers. At a minimum, read the abstracts, find out what they are about, and so that'll show you the subject they're interested in. And then you've got a sort of opening to start a conversation, and then then you can start a conversation. If you really wanted to find out what a group was like, that's where you'd want to maybe do some sort of placement or course with them. That's the only way you're going to really find out if you actually like a particular group. It's not something that just appears in a 10-minute conversation. You have to sort of see day to day what's the situation like. But most people would just love talking about themselves. So if you could find out what they do, do a little bit of research, it should be fairly easy to talk. I mean, I realize right now you can't just go and walk into someone's office or suggest a meeting in someone's office. So it's you got to be a bit more explicit. Like, say, I've been talking about this. Perhaps we could chat on Zoom sometime. But I think most people, for people who are genuinely interested and made a bit of an effort, I think you'd be surprised how willing people are to accommodate you and talk to you. And if they don't have any advice, like to work with them, I've got a big network of scientists I talk to routinely all around the world, so I can sort of give other suggestions about people you might reach out to. Yeah, so don't be afraid to try and tap into other people's networks. So you just need to do a little bit of research. The emails I don't like are when you say, "Oh, could we just talk about graduate school?" Like a one-line email. You need to craft a sort of short paragraph that sort of goes in a little bit of detail about why you want to have a conversation and what you want to talk about. So, spend a little bit of time actually making some polish. What looks really bad if they have typos, write people's names wrong, or use the wrong title to address an email, or there's a little bit of formality you need to think about to write an email. But most people will be very happy to reach out to you if you go to the trouble to do that little research. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah, and if you've got any questions for me, and you're willing to take the time to ask a sensible question rather than just, do you have advice on writing to graduate school? If you've got a really specific question, I can give you a specific answer. I'm busy like everyone else, but I will take the time to reply to people who ask me sensible questions. And commensal too, as the graduate chair of our department.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Wells.
Okay.
We will post your email then, your school email then, as well as the recording of this, which we've been recording the whole time, and the slides along with it, so that everybody can access the links on our website and on our Discord. So if anybody's looking for those resources later, then feel free to check them out. But yeah, I'd like to say thank you again to Professor Wells for joining us, and we'll close it up here. So I hope everybody had a good time, learned something.